Hi, Rupert.
Hi.
Just a simple question. I just want to make sure that I understand this morning's meditation correctly and the portal. So the knowledge or sense I am is not yet the real self, consciousness. That's only a portal to take you deeper to the real self, which is nothing. Is that a correct understanding of the meditation?
The feeling of being, or the thought I am, it is not the actual experience of ourself. That is, it is not consciousness's knowledge of itself. It is the first form of that knowledge, and that is why, for the separate self to take the thought I am, or to go to the feeling of being, is a stepping stone on its way back to itself. But the thought I am and the feeling of being is not itself our being. It is just the first expression of that being.
So that thought I am, however, it's already at the capital I thought, not the small self.
There isn't a small self.
Right.
That there just isn't a small self. There is just the self, seemingly limited by thinking and perceiving. But even then, it is still the same self. There is just the actor, John Smith. When he assumes the part of King Lear, he doesn't become a smaller version of John Smith. He remains the fully blown John Smith that he is before he assumes the part of King Lear. Only he acquires an apparent limitation. But even then, that the self of King Lear is the self of John Smith. So the self of each of us now is the only self there is, infinite consciousness, albeit seemingly limited by or colored by thinking and perceiving.
Hi, Rupert. I find that there's this cloudiness on my idea about the separate self that I'm hoping you can clarify. How negative is a separate self? If the separate self is a manifestation of us individual persons or perspective, seeing the world, bring the world into play, the potential of this wonderful world is within us, in some sense. Would it be appropriate to say that our innate being, our true sense of being, the work there is to befriend the separate self and make it not feel separate? Because what I'm stuck on is this sense that it's still this separate self, as I understood some of the way you speak, that is the crystallization of this wonderful world. That if we were just not diffracted as an individual person, thing, entity, consciousness, that we just be in borderless, awareness.
Let's use the analogy of John Smith and King Lear. That in order for the play to take place, John Smith has to assume the role of King Lear. John Smith cannot become the King of England or the father of 3 daughters or go to war with the French without becoming King Lear. So he has to become King Lear for the drama to take place. Now, King Lear doesn't have to believe that he is a temporary finite self called King Lear. King Lear has 2 options. He can either forget his true nature, I am John Smith, and as a result believe I am this temporary finite limited mortal self called King Lear, in which case he will suffer. Or he can still play the role of King Lear, but without forgetting or overlooking his true nature. It's not really King Lear that makes that decision. It is John Smith that can either play the role of King Lear and lose himself in the character of King Lear, and as a result he suffers, or he still plays the part of King Lear, but he doesn't forget himself in the process. So he has to become King Lear, or seem to become King Lear, for the play to begin. That is mandatory. Consciousness has to localize itself as a finite mind in order to know the world. That is the mechanism through which consciousness knows objective experience. But that experience doesn't have to come with the belief of being a separate self. In other words, it is quite possible for us to still seem to be this character that each of us seems to be, without believing that what we essentially are is a temporary finite self. So we still view the world from the perspective of, or through the agency of, this body, but there is no actual separate self lurking inside. Just as John Smith plays the part of King Lear without there ever being a person called King Lear present in the picture. It is only when John Smith forgets that he is John Smith that he seems to become the person King Lear. That is what's called the ego. It's not the role of King Lear that is the ego. It is the belief, I am a temporary finite self. The Buddha still knew the world from the localized perspective of his body. In other words, he still saw the world from a temporary, finite, limited point of view, but there was no sense of being a separate self inside him. So, in other words, the temporary, finite mind that each of us seems to be is not a problem. It is the means by which consciousness is able to know objective experience. As such, it is the agent of creativity. It is each of our finite minds is what it enables consciousness to know its innate potential in form. It is the very agent of creativity. It's only a problem when the finite mind overlooks its essence or its nature and believes that it is a finite mind. That is a problem. So the ego as a mechanism of creativity is not a problem, but when it becomes a belief, then it's a problem. Or I should say, the finite mind is not by itself a problem. It is the agency through which consciousness knows form. It is only a belief when the finite mind thinks, I am an entity unto myself. I am a limited, discrete entity. That is the problem. And that's what's normally called the ego, the belief that I am a temporary finite self. And when that belief goes, we still continue to be this localization of consciousness.
So we could be King Lear and not ultimately suffer.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes, exactly. King Lear only suffers. His suffering is not brought about because of the way his daughters treat him. His suffering is brought about because he believes, I am a temporary, finite, discrete self. In other words, his suffering comes about because he has overlooked or forgotten his true nature, John Smith. It is quite possible for John Smith to play the part of King Lear without overlooking or forgetting himself. In other words, without ever actually believing or feeling, I am King Lear. Likewise, it is quite possible for us in this lifetime to play the role of a man or a woman or a husband or a wife or a mother or a father or whatever, without ever overlooking or forgetting our essential self or essential nature.
And is the outward-facing path the actual process of, an example of our innate being celebrating this manifestation with no longer forgetting that we're part of.
Exactly. The outward-facing path is the means by which we learn to live a life fully in the world that is without losing touch with the piece of our true nature. Yes. Finite mind is on the contrary, the means by which consciousness is able to know objective experience. If that finite mind believes that it is a discrete, separate entity, then even then it's not an evil thing, but it's the cause of suffering and the cause of separation. And as a result of that feeling of separation, the finite mind then behaves in ways that we consider to be evil. Cruelty, unkindness, because the finite mind then thinks everyone else is separate from me, and therefore I can behave in a way towards them that doesn't affect me. That's why one of the tenets of Christianity: do unto others as you would be done by. This is just a way of saying it's exactly what Saint Augustine said: love and do whatever you want. It means recognize that others are yourself. Recognize that we share our being and act in the world accordingly. That the separate self is the self that does not realize that its being is shared by everybody else, and therefore it treats others as others. And that is what enables us to act in a way that we consider to be evil or wrong.
Hi, Rupert. I'm trying to understand if you're using the phrases the finite mind and the separate self synonymously, or to describe sort of two layers of potential
Yes.
identification.
I may sometimes not be I may be a little casual in my use of these two terms, because there's a distinction between them, and it relates to the conversation that I had with Paul. The finite mind by itself is not a mistake, it's not a problem, it's not a sign of ignorance. It is, as we said, it is the agency through which the infinite is able to know the finite. Mm-hmm. The character of King Lear is the agency through which John Smith is able to have a relationship with Cordelia. There's no ignorance in that. It's the means by which that relationship takes place. So the finite mind is the means by which consciousness is able to know objective experience. That's the finite mind. The separate self, or the apparently separate self, would be the belief that finite mind has that it is a discrete, independent entity. Mm-hmm. So in this case, it's not just the finite mind, it is more than just a mechanism of a finite mind. It is that finite mind's belief that it is a separately or independently existing finite mind.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful. And so to map this onto direct experience, the experience of the localization of consciousness as a body.
Mind. Yes.
That's the finite mind.
That's the finite mind. And the body is what, the body is what that localization looks like from the outside. Mm-hmm. So for instance, you are not seeing your body now. You're experiencing a cluster of thoughts, feelings, sensations and perceptions. You can hardly see anything of your body, but maybe just a hand mm-hmm. But all of us see your body. So what we are all looking at is your finite mind from a second person perspective. Mm-hmm. The finite mind is just the experience of thinking, sensing, and perceiving.
Okay.
And like this morning, we realized, we started off with describing experience as comprising thinking, sensing, and perceiving, thoughts, images, feelings, etc. And then at one stage we realized we're actually only ever having one experience at a time. It's not thinking, sensing, and perceiving. It's thinking, sensing, perceiving, written without any spaces in between. It's one experience.
Yeah.
And if we then, the essence of that experience is knowing.
Mm-hmm.
But to realize that we're only ever having one experience, thinking, sensing, perceiving, written as one word, we're still experiencing objective experience, but it is no longer a multiplicity and diversity of objects. It is a single objective experience.
Mm-hmm.
It's like looking at a movie, and instead of seeing 10,000 people in the movie, we see one image. We're still seeing the image.
Mm-hmm.
The movie is still present, but we've realized, I'm not seeing 10,000 people, I'm seeing one image. And then we go from the one image, we realize, all there is to that image is the screen. So to translate that, first of all we think, I'm experiencing 10,000 things. Then we realize, no, we're not experiencing 10,000 things. We're not having 10,000 experiences. We're always having one experience, thinking, sensing, perceiving. That's like a halfway stage, a stepping stone.
Okay.
And then we touch the stuff that thinking, sensing, perceiving is made of, and we realize all that is there is knowing, or it is a modulation of knowing. So we go from the 10,000 people in the movie to one image, and then from one image to the screen.
And the experience of 10,000 people and the collapse to realize there is one experience, both of those are the finite mind.
Yes, exactly. Whether you're seeing 10,000 people or one image, you're still seeing something objective.
Right.
So whether we're seeing 10,000 things or we're experiencing thinking, sensing, perceiving one thing, it's still objective experience. And this localization of a finite mind is required for that experience.
In the past, it was, I think I had a strong belief that Jimmy, was doing, creating, and making things happen. And it just feels recently more and more that I guess this association with me, Jimmy, is not doing. So I guess my question is, and what I heard in a couple of the last couple shares is that awareness is really the doing. And it's almost like me, this body, is the way that doing gets done.
Yes, exactly. There is no self inside your body, either to do something or not to do something. So it's not that the separate self is not a doer, it's that there is no separate self or finite self, either to be a doer or not to be a doer. When you have a thought, if you look for the self that is doing or having that thought, you will never find it. In fact, it only exists as the thought that there is a separate self. The actual separate self to which that thought refers is never found. The same is true for any feeling or perception.
It's a bit mind-blowing in the sense because I lived for so long thinking that I was doing.
Yes, you live for so long just thinking that I, the separate self, exist. Doing, thinking, feeling, acting. Yes, exactly. And then suddenly you look inside and you realize that there is no temporary finite self, there is no limited consciousness. Just like we investigate the space of this room, and we find the space of this room is not limited by the four walls of this room. Likewise, we investigate the space or nature of ourself that seems like this space seems to be in this room that seems to be in our body, and we sample the nature of ourself, and we find no limitations there. There is no the self that we feel ourself to be, and each of us does feel, I am myself. But if we go to that experience, I am myself, we find no limitation there. If King Lear looks in himself and tries to find the person King Lear, he never finds it. There is no person called King Lear. The only person there is John Smith. It's not even King Lear that looks to see if there is a character called King Lear, because King Lear is simply a limitation of John Smith. So it is John Smith in the form of King Lear that looks to see if there is a person called Lear and never finds one. It is infinite consciousness in the form of each of our minds that turns round and looks inside itself and says, can I find myself a separate self? And never can.
So how would you answer the question if someone said to you, how did you come up with that idea?
The idea that I've just had?
No, just any, just, if I just, if...
Well, let's take the idea that I've just had, that I just expressed. I listened to your answer. Sorry, I listened to your question, then I paused, and then the answer appeared.
But any personal, like, how did you come up with that idea?
It just appeared.
It just appeared.
There's no I in me that manufactured the idea. I heard your question, pause, and then the response appeared, and as it appeared, I spoke it. But if I look for the I who spoke it or the I who thought it, I never find a personal I or a separate I. When I say I thought it or I spoke it, it's just a linguistic convention. It's just the way we express our experience, but there is no personal self in me that thought up my response. There was just question, pause, response. There was never a self in between the two. There is no orchestrator of those thoughts and actions. It's like a symphony without a conductor. The feeling of being, or the thought I am, it is not the actual experience of ourself. That is, it is not consciousness's knowledge of itself. It is the first form of that knowledge, and that is why, for the separate self to take the thought I am, or to go to the feeling of being, is a stepping stone on its way back to itself. But the thought I am and the feeling of being is not itself our being. It is just the first expression of that being. That there isn't a small self. That there just isn't a small self. There is just the self, seemingly limited by thinking and perceiving. But even then, it is still the same self. There is just the actor, John Smith. When he assumes the part of King Lear, he doesn't become a smaller version of John Smith. He remains the fully blown John Smith that he is before he assumes the part of King Lear. Only he acquires an apparent limitation. But even then, that the self of King Lear is the self of John Smith. So the self of each of us now is the only self there is
infinite consciousness, albeit seemingly limited by or colored by thinking and perceiving.